At 2:17 in the morning, a British drone operator at Camp Bastion was watching his infrared feed when his brain simply refused to process what was on the screen. One heat signature, one vehicle, moving in wild, asymmetric loops across the floor of a narrow Afghan valley, and converging on it from 3 directions: 30 trucks, 150 armed men, a horseshoe closing. The operator keyed his radio and said, voice stripped of all pretense of calm, either that he genuinely didn't know what he was looking at. His supervisor leaned over, studied the screen for 4 full seconds and said nothing. Because what you say when one man in one vehicle holds off 150 fighters for 31 minutes and doesn't die is nothing. You just watch. And when it was over, a 2-star NATO general read the after-action report 3 times, pushed back from his desk and said out loud to an empty room that it was not possible. And the citation that would eventually be written used 40 words. The story needs considerably more. To understand what Daniel Reeves did that night, you first need to understand what Helmand in 2008 actually was. Not the version from press briefings. The real one. The one that soldiers who served there carry in the backs of their eyes for the rest of their lives. By 2008, Britain had over 8,000 troops in Helmand Province, officially deployed on a reconstruction mission. And what the soldiers on the ground called it was a continuous rolling contact battle against an enemy that materialized from the dirt itself and dissolved back into it before the echo of the gunfire died. The Taliban in Helmand were not defeated remnants. They were a reconstituted insurgency that had spent years studying how the coalition operated, mapping every patrol route, every QRF timeline, every dead angle in the surveillance grids, and building a system of warfare designed specifically to neutralize every advantage that Western technology was supposed to provide. And it was working. Patrol bases were being rocketed every night. Infantry platoons were pouring enormous amounts of firepower into tree lines and compounds, and at the end of 8-hour firefights finding only blood trails and discarded weapons. The conventional playbook, armor, artillery, air superiority, and the grinding weight of industrial military capacity, was producing diminishing returns against men in sandals with AKs and a willingness to die that no precision-guided munition could erode. In the headquarters, beneath the official language of progress and stabilization, there was something quieter and more honest. The creeping recognition that the war was not going the way the math said it should. Into this theater, in numbers that conventional commanders found almost insulting, came the men of 22 SAS D Squadron in rotation, small teams, sometimes 4 men, sometimes fewer. The brigadier commanding British forces in the province was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and what he meant in a moment of candid frustration his staff found uncomfortable was that however good the SAS were, light infantry cannot hold ground against an insurgency when they are outnumbered 1,000 to 1. He was not wrong in his arithmetic. He was measuring the wrong things entirely. And because what conventional military thinking consistently underweights is the psychological dimension of warfare. Not morale, not unit cohesion. The psychology of the enemy. The specific weight that falls on a fighting organization when it realizes, not through intelligence briefings but through the raw experience of combat, that something is hunting it. Something it cannot see, cannot predict, and cannot run from. Over the course of that deployment, Taliban commanders in Helmand started making decisions they had not previously made. They stopped using phones. They stopped using fixed meeting locations. They dispersed their logistics. Safe houses were hit with no warning. Commanders disappeared between one prayer call and the next. Weapons caches hidden with meticulous security turned up empty, cleared by hands that left no trace. The whisper networks inside the insurgency started carrying a different kind of message, are not tactical information. Fear. The specific bone-deep fear of being hunted by something that operates outside the rules you thought the game was played by. Daniel Reeves was 26 years old. He had passed SAS selection, which is not a course, not a training program, but an extended methodical process of destruction designed to find out who a man actually is when there is nothing left. The Brecon beacons in winter. Cold that doesn't go away. Rain that is not weather but a condition. The hills that go up at grades that make your vision tunnel. And through it, alone, carrying loads that would break a pack animal with no team, no encouragement, no external permission to stop. Most candidates fail, not because they run out of physical capacity, because the voice gets too loud, the voice that says you have done enough that no reasonable person would keep going, that stopping now is justified. The SAS selection is a machine for identifying the men in whom that voice can be heard clearly, assessed calmly, and then set aside. Not silenced. Set aside. The men who pass have not found a way to make the discomfort go away. They have found a way to keep moving while it is there, and that is a completely different thing. It is the difference between a trained reflex and a conscious decision, and in a firefight at night on a broken vehicle under RPG fire, you do not have time for conscious decisions. You only have what your body already knows. Reeves knew his body's fear response the way a surgeon knows anatomy. He had been in firefights before. He had sat in the silence after them and done the accounting. He knew exactly what would happen to him when it got bad, which meant he could work inside it instead of against it. That knowledge, built across years and deployments and moments where stopping was possible and not stopping was chosen, it was the real weapon he brought into the valley that night. He had been sent on a solo night reconnaissance of routes northwest of Camp Bastion where intelligence flagged increased Taliban logistics movement. The vehicle was a Jackal, an open-frame, long-wheelbase weapons platform built on the principle that mobility and firepower compensate for the protection you sacrifice by not being in an armored box. Its silhouette is low and lean and built for speed across rough ground. His Jackal carried a Browning M2.50 caliber heavy machine gun. The Emma Deuce, a weapon that has been stopping vehicles and breaking formations since 1933 and shows no sign of becoming obsolete. 2 Milan anti-tank guided missiles in their launch tube configuration, and the standard SAS emergency kit that every operator carries regardless of the apparent nature of the mission. He was 14 kilometers from base, alone in the dark, even the specific silence that comes from moving through hostile terrain at night with everything switched off that doesn't need to be on, when the radio produced the transmission that changes the shape of a night forever. 30 pickup trucks confirmed by multiple observation sources, 3 converging approach routes, estimated 150 fighters, horseshoe formation already closing around the valley where Reeves was currently operating. Air support, 34 minutes out. Ground rescue, 22 kilometers across terrain that was partially mined and completely impassable at speed in the dark. The numbers were simple and the conclusion they pointed to was equally simple. And below him, in a small village on the valley floor whose population had been trying to sleep through a war for years, was a forward outpost with 6 British soldiers. All of them wounded in an engagement 2 days prior, and all of them waiting on a medevac that weather and threat levels had been delaying. All of them guarded by local personnel whose reliability under the kind of pressure now approaching could not be guaranteed. If the Taliban column made it through the valley, those soldiers were not going to be captured. They were going to be killed. Reeves ran the geometry of the valley in the time it takes most people to decide what to order for lunch. He knew the terrain. He had been reading it since he entered the valley, building the 3-dimensional model that SAS training forces into reflex. One point on the valley floor could simultaneously interdict all 3 approach routes. One point where the ground itself would force the enemy into a compressed corridor and reduce their ability to maneuver. That point was a low ridge on the eastern valley edge, exposed on three sides, no meaningful cover behind it that would survive RPG fire, well within effective range of the enemy the moment his position was identified. He turned the Jackal toward it. He acquired the lead element of the primary column in the M2's sights and he fired. The .50 caliber at that range does not wound, it does not suppress, it deletes. The burst was accurate and it was devastating. The first truck exploded. Whatever was in the bed, ammunition or fuel or both, cooked off immediately, and the secondary detonation was visible from the drone feed as a sudden violent bloom of white in the infrared. The second truck was stopped in the road, engine compartment shredded, cab destroyed, blocking the passage completely. The route was physically obstructed. For approximately 4 seconds, the entire Taliban column hesitated. 4 seconds in which 150 men were processing the information that the two vehicles at the front of their formation had just ceased to exist. 4 seconds of unscripted tactical confusion. And then they did exactly what their training told them to do. Orient toward the contact, establish support by fire maneuver. 148 fighters moving with the confidence of men who had done this before, and won. The remaining 28 trucks were converging on his position within seconds. A PKM general-purpose machine gun crew dismounted and set up to the northwest, immediately finding his elevation and beginning to lay suppressing fire across the ridge. RPG teams were off their vehicles and moving. Radio traffic screamed across Taliban frequencies as commanders pushed fighters to flanking positions with the controlled urgency of a unit that has identified a fixed target and is bringing its full weight to bear on it. Every rifle and every tube in that valley was now pointed at one ridge line and one vehicle sitting in the open on it. And the first RPG hit 4 meters to his left. The overpressure wave from the detonation physically lifted the Jackal's rear and slammed it sideways into a rock formation. The steering mechanism jammed. The vehicle could no longer turn left. A jammed steering system in a firefight means you cannot maneuver. And a vehicle that cannot maneuver on an open valley floor against 140 fighters with RPGs is already a coffin with an engine. Reeves didn't withdraw. He adapted. And the terrain had specific features. A depression here, a rock outcropping there, the burning hulks of the 2 trucks he had just destroyed. And he began using those features as the architecture of a new movement pattern. Asymmetric loops, improvised around the mechanical constraint, using the ground as a substitute for the directional control he no longer had. Unconventional, unpredictable, because it had to be. Because that unpredictability, born purely of necessity, was the only thing keeping the RPG teams from getting a clean firing solution on a vehicle that was sitting in the open with no cover and no speed advantage over anything. The PKM burst that came through the cracked windscreen minutes later took out the primary radio. He was now without long-range communication, with air support still deep in the future and fighters actively maneuvering to within 80 meters of his position. That was when the M2 jammed, and the barrel temperature had gone well beyond its rated continuous fire parameters. The weapon locked solid. In a crew-served configuration, clearing a machine gun jam is a 10-second managed drill. Reeves was alone. He dismounted the vehicle under active fire with fighters 80 meters away and closing, and he worked the clearing procedure with his bare hands because the weapon was too hot for gloves and there was no time to wait for it to cool, and the mechanism was fouled with heat-distorted brass and a feed tray failure. It took 40 seconds to clear, 40 seconds in which the flanking element covered half the remaining distance. 40 seconds in which the smoke from the burning trucks was the primary thing standing between him and the fighters who were now close enough that he could hear their radio traffic. He cleared the weapon. He remounted. He got back behind the gun and stopped the flanking element before they reached 50 meters. But the situation was not better. The Taliban formation was reorganizing. 3 groups, 3 vectors, methodical and competent. The math was very clear about where this was going. This is the moment the drone operator described as the one that stepped outside the category of things that are supposed to be possible. And because instead of doing what every tactical manual ever written would tell him to do, fall back, put distance between himself and the converging elements, find elevation, Reeves accelerated directly toward the central formation. Not away from it, into it. He drove the Jackal at maximum speed through the gap between 2 enemy pickup trucks at a separation of less than 20 meters. The tactical logic was not insane, even if the nerve required to execute it exists in a category beyond brave. The 3 converging groups were coordinating. If you drove through the center of the formation and fractured that coordination, made each group suddenly uncertain of where the threat was, where their flanking elements were, which direction to fire, you could break the organism into its panicking parts. And parts that are confused and disoriented will, in smoke and noise and darkness, engage each other. Muzzle flash from AK fire was visible in Reeves' peripheral vision as he drove through, and the Jackal took rounds. The armor held. On the other side, coming out hard right on his only functional steering axis, he could already hear fire from the central group going in directions it was not supposed to go. Friendly fire in a Taliban formation. Engineered confusion, not an accident. A weapon. He had 2 Milan missiles remaining. The Milan is an anti-tank missile system. Its purpose, in every doctrinal use case ever written, is defeating armored vehicles at range. And what Reeves did with them had never been documented in combat before that night. He fired both at the rock face above the eastern approach route, not at a vehicle, not at a personnel concentration, at the rock itself. The eastern route ran through a narrow gap between a fractured limestone wall and the valley floor. 2 Milan warheads detonating against that structure at the right angles didn't just crack the rock, they brought several tons of it down onto the route, and the third arm of the Taliban's horseshoe was physically sealed, not suppressed. Sealed, with a debris field that no pickup truck was getting through for hours. An improvised geological obstacle created from an anti-tank missile system deployed against terrain. No doctrine existed for it. It had never been trained for. It was the product of a mind that, in the hardest 30 minutes of its life, on a broken vehicle without radio or steering, he was still thinking architecturally about physics and terrain and the relationship between the tools it had and the problems those tools had never been designed to solve. The Jackal was done. The second tire was shredded, the engine cutting in and out, the vehicle riding on its rims and grinding forward in a smoke-trailing arc that was not maneuvering anymore but something more like dying in motion. When the engine finally threw its last and stopped, and the vehicle was sitting dead on the valley floor. 4 rims on Afghan dust, engine cold, armor punched through in 16 places, M2 pointing at the sky at an angle it was never designed to assume. Reeves had 1 weapon left with any ammunition, his personal rifle. And in the emergency kit he carried as standard SAS load, he had a portable GPS communicator capable of transmitting on emergency frequencies. He pulled it out, and he transmitted his coordinates in a compressed sitrep in the language of a man who has seconds, not minutes. The signal was received. The clock was now 4 minutes from the moment 2 AH-64 Apache attack helicopters would appear on the horizon. He needed to guide them in. The primary radio was dead. The secondary was dead. He had a signal mirror, a flat piece of polished metal with a hole in the center. He climbed onto the hood of the dead Jackal. In the open, and with active fighters at various distances still in the valley around him. And he worked the mirror against the light of the burning trucks below, the coded flash pattern that says, "I am here. I am friendly. I am alive. Come to me." The Apaches saw it. The engagement that followed lasted 6 minutes and ended the night conclusively. When the Apaches were done, the valley was quiet in the way that valleys go quiet after enormous amounts of ordnance have been spent in them, and the forward outpost below was intact. All 6 wounded soldiers were alive. The medevac arrived 40 minutes later and moved them without further incident. Post-engagement intelligence assessment confirmed 34 enemy killed in action, 11 vehicles destroyed. 150 fighters had been stopped, fragmented, and destroyed in detail. For 31 minutes, the only thing between that column and those men had been one soldier, one vehicle, it had a mind that refused to stop working even as everything around it was falling apart. The physical accounting of those 31 minutes when it arrived looked nothing like heroism in the movie sense. Both hands wrapped in field dressings where the skin had been burned by the M2 barrel and the clearing mechanism. Bruised ribs from the RPG shockwave that he hadn't noticed during the engagement because the adrenaline had been doing its job of suppressing the pain. On a laceration across the back of his left hand from the clearing process. And the involuntary tremor in his hands that comes after extreme stress response. Not weakness, not shock, but the body releasing the grip it had been holding. The honest report of the nervous system on what it had just been asked to sustain. He was 26 years old. He had done something that none of the doctrine writers or intelligence analysts who would later try to describe it had any pre-existing framework for describing. And when the Land Rover that brought him back reached Camp Bastion, the first thing he asked about was the 6 soldiers from the outpost. He was told they were being medevaced. He nodded. He looked out the window at the Hellman morning and said nothing else of substance. This, too, is not unusual in the regiment, and the processing happens later, privately. The institution understands this because it has been sending men into situations that exceed the design parameters of normal human experience for a long time. But the professional accounting was immediate, and it moved up the chain of command fast, because what was being reported was outside the category of things that had previously been reported. The brigadier who had said light infantry couldn't change a province-wide campaign received the intelligence assessment 3 days after the engagement. He read it twice. Then he called his intelligence officer and asked him something his intelligence officer couldn't answer. How many engagements like this are not in the reporting? How many times had the SAS done things like this and the documentation existed only in regimental archives above his clearance level? He put the assessment down. He looked at it for a moment and said in a tone his intelligence officer later described as genuinely humbled, that he needed to reconsider some of his previous assumptions about what small numbers of highly capable people could accomplish. This was not a sudden conversion to a new philosophy of war, but it was a crack in the certainty with which mass and technology had been privileged over quality and selection. And cracks in certainties have a way of expanding. 2 months later, in a ceremony at Hereford that was, like all such ceremonies in the regiment, entirely private, Daniel Reeves was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross. Second highest military decoration in the British system. The citation was 40 words. In the culture of 22 SAS, this brevity is not modesty. It is precision. 40 words for 31 minutes. But the 40 words are not the story. They are the marker that says the story exists. And the story, when you follow it from the first burst on the lead truck to the mirror flashing from the hood of a dead jackal, does something to the comfortable narrative most of us have absorbed about what wins wars. The narrative that says it is always the side with the most hardware, the biggest budget, the most satellites in orbit. The narrative that the contribution of a single individual is a rounding error in the mathematics of modern conflict. That narrative fits on a spreadsheet. It is also wrong. You can fund a procurement program for Milan anti-tank missiles, but you cannot fund the creative leap that looks at a limestone rock face and sees a tactical option. You can build the most sophisticated drone surveillance system in history, and it will give you a perfect infrared picture of a man sitting on the hood of a destroyed vehicle with a signal mirror in a burned hand, and it will not be able to tell you what it cost him to sit there, or what it means that he chose to. And that understanding comes from a different kind of accounting. One that starts not with capability assessments, but with the question that the drone operator was already asking when he first keyed his radio. Not what is this, but how? How does a force that small move like that, hit like that, hold like that? The answer is years. The break-on beacons in the rain, the clearing drill until it lives in the hands, and the culture that is old enough and honest enough to know what it produces and disciplined enough to never need to say it out loud because the men inside it already know, because they made it through selection, because they cleared the weapon with burned hands, because they drove through the middle of 150 fighters in a damaged vehicle and improvised an anti-tank missile into a geological obstacle and then climbed onto the hood with a signal mirror and guided the cavalry home. One soldier, one vehicle, one machine gun, one mind that would not stop, and the valley held.